Peace, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Does anyone in this room eat food? Okay. Does anyone in this room live on land? Nobody lives in a houseboat? Okay. I'm still waiting to meet someone who lives in a houseboat. So we have a lot in common, and we all are in the right place, because pretty much all of us, we eat food. If we're fortunate enough, we live on land, and so the food system has everything to do with our everyday life. And I'm super excited to be here with you talking about this topic, which I'm really very, very passionate about. And if y'all have ever rocked with any event in the Black community, you know that we start in a particular way, right? What is that? We honor who? Our ancestors. Don't be shy. This is Williams. Y'all supposed to be really smart. You know this. All right. So I want to call a particular ancestor into the room, and I'm going to also invite you to call your ancestors too. So I want to call in Susie Boyd. She's my grandma's grandma's grandma. And she, like so many women who were living in the Dahomey region of West Africa in the 17 and 1800s, were watching their family members get kidnapped, snatched up. You know, their brothers, their uncles, their cousins, their children. They were stolen, they were put in ships, there was no report backs. And so what they decided to do, because they didn't know when their time would come to also be, victim to this kidnapping, is they gathered up their sorghum, okra, cowpea, millet, black rice, agouti melon, all these seeds that they'd been saving for generations, and they braided them into their hair. Because they believed against odds in a future of tilling and reaping on soil, and they believed that we, the descendants, would exist to inherit that seed. Now that is foresight, that is courage, right? So when I feel discouraged, which I often do, this is hard work, I always think, well, if they didn't give up on me in that situation, who am I to give up on my descendants, right? So I invite you to think of an ancestor who had foresight for you. And at the count of 3, we're gonna call their names together really loud and strong, like we mean it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Samuel Cornelius Smith. Shay, we're gonna do that one more time, a little louder. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Nana Woodcomb. Shay. Beautiful. I also really appreciate that we've already given a shout out and land acknowledgement to the Mohican Nation. Soulfire Farm, which is just 30 minutes west of here, is also on unceded Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican territory. And we've been really blessed to be invited out to the reservation in Bowler, Wisconsin, and start to build relationships, and really think it's not enough just to name the stolen land we're on, but to act in solidarity. So for example, the Mohican people right now have a struggle to save their ancestral burial grounds on Pasquini Island from a pipeline called the E37 pipeline, and they're not getting enough signatures and support to try to stop that pipeline. So that's a really tangible thing they can get organized around and put public comments in to stop the E37, because it would go right through their sacred council fires on Pasquini Island. And the third shout out that we always give is to the team, because the reason I do not have any chicken poop on my boots at all right now is because somebody else does. And it's really important. Anything worth doing pretty much is done as a team. And so I want to give thanks to all the farmers at Soulfire holding it down, Larissa, Demaris, Letitia, Cheryl, Jonah, and so forth, because we are in it together. So that's the squad. Would somebody be willing to read this quote?
A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Marcus Garvey.
Thank you. So we don't want to be like a rootless tree, so we need to understand our history. And I'm going to put forth a hypothesis that the history of the food system is really rooted in 2 things. It's rooted in the theft of land, so stolen lands, and the exploitation of labor. And that fundamentally, that DNA of the food system has not shifted over the course of time. So we're going to go through some history, understand why that's my hypothesis. And then we'll talk a little bit about the resistance movements that are going on, the work of Soulfire and others to try to rectify and change that history. So we're going to start back with the seed braids. This beautiful painting was done by my sister Naima of our great-great-great-great-grandmother, Susie Boyd, braiding cowpea into her hair, along with all these other African seeds. Has anyone ever gotten their hair braided before? What's it like? Yes. What else? Time-consuming and painful. You are sitting between someone's knees, sometimes for hours, while you get your style put in. And while you're sitting there for hours, there's some very important cultural transmission that happens, right? Story, song, connection. And so I imagine, this is Midrash, right? So I imagine that while those seeds were getting braided, stories were also getting passed down. Stories about how to use those seeds properly. Stories about how to be in right relationship with the land, right relationship with human beings. So if you look at all these technologies on the right-hand side, these are African indigenous farming technologies. Many of them that people think of as European or ahistorical. Things like composting, right? The first documented composter was Cleopatra in 59 BCE. She literally had a decree where you'd be put to death if you harmed an earthworm. And she had a whole cadre of priests whose full-time work was dedicated to the study of the habits of earthworms and getting them to proliferate across the Nile River Delta because of their incredible fertilizing impacts. The USDA went over in 1949, took some soil cores, and were like, oh my goodness, there's 10 times the worm castings from that, during that era as compared to surrounding times. Things like terraces, raised beds, even the work party. The idea of a volunteer day, that comes out of the Dahomey region of West Africa. It's called Dokwe in West Africa. It's called Convict in Haiti. But it's like, I'm going to go plant beans at your house on Saturday, and then we're all going to go to your house next week and plant beans, and then your house the week after. And then our harvest is staggered, and whoever hosts the work party provides the soup and the brass band. That's how it's done, right? The credit union. The original credit union was a susu. So many technologies, I imagine, getting braided. Don't forget what the right relationship is to land. Don't forget what the right relationship is to one another. But of course, the project of settler colonialism had different ideas, right? Remember I mentioned the DNA of the food system being stolen land and exploited labor. Does anyone recognize this picture? What is it? Manifest Destiny. What is that?
The white man's destiny to expand westward.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that somehow Europeans have a God-given right to colonize the continent. And this idea is older than this 1820s painting. It actually goes back to 1455 at least, when Pope Nicholas of the Catholic Church put out a decree that said that white Christian nations should go forth, colonize, enslave, and pillage so-called heathen nations. It was the beginning of the age of the discovery, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, all of that stuff came out of the Catholic Church's decree. But it wasn't over then. It's become a fundamental pillar of US property law. So if you look at the McIntosh Supreme Court case in 1823, that idea of the doctrine of discovery, finders keepers as it's nicknamed, becomes foundational to our understanding of who has the right to land. It's been tested many times in the Supreme Court, most recently in 2005 when Justice Ginsburg handed down the majority opinion to the Oneida Nation, saying that they did not have the rights to reclaim their unceded territories because under the doctrine of discovery, they're considered domestic dependent nations and not sovereign. And so fundamentally, we've never rectified this whole issue of stealing the land. Even the reservations where indigenous folks are placed are still controlled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the federal government. They're not truly sovereign. And who do you see retreating in the wake of Lady Columbia? Who has to get out of the way? Indigenous people and the buffalo, the ecology itself. Right? So the second pillar of the food system is, of course, exploited labor. We know that 12.5 million African people survived the Middle Passage. Untold millions perished along the way, both in the march across Africa and also in the sea. And one myth that I believed up until really recently was that somehow Black folks were stolen because of the idea of physical strength or the ability to work hard, long days. What I didn't know until I studied the work of Judith Carney, who's an anthropologist who wrote Black Rice and many other volumes, is that agricultural experts were particularly targeted by the slavers. Which makes sense if you think about it. What's the climate in Northern Europe? Cold. What's the climate in Cuba, Brazil, Florida? Who knows how to farm there? Not Northern Europeans, right? And so there was a need for, rice experts, cattle grazing experts, sugarcane experts, and so people were specifically targeted. And when I lived in West Africa for several months, in my 20s, I came to understand also how the theft of the best farmers really decimated life on the continent as well. So there was harm, obviously, on both sides. So these folks built the multi-trillion-dollar rice industry, sugarcane, tobacco, so forth in this country. And in some ways, if that was all ancient history, it would seem like, oh, okay, we've moved on, it's been a few hundred years. But if you look throughout the timeline of the United States, these patterns of stolen land and exploited labor keep repeating, right? This picture is in the late 1860s. Does anyone know what system is represented here? Yeah, convict leasing, exactly. So convict leasing is this, takes advantage of a little loophole in the 13th Amendment. Has anyone seen the documentary 13th, the Ava DuVernay? Okay, definitely watch it if you haven't seen it. But essentially, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, except in the case if you've been convicted of a crime. And so the South, after 1865, is having a complete freak out, because if there's no chattel slavery, the economy basically collapses. So what they do is institute a whole bunch of new laws called the Black Codes. It criminalizes things like vagrancy, loitering. Does anyone know what either of those are? What's loitering? Yeah, like y'all, like just doing nothing, right? What's vagrancy? Not having a job, specifically not having a year-long contract on a farm. And so those become crimes. The prisons fill with black people. And then they're leased back to the plantations, the mines, and the railroads. One of the crimes that I saw listed was actually not being upright and honest. And the punishment for not being upright and honest is have your children taken away and apprenticed to their former masters, which was the beginning of the state social services system of taking people's children away, right? And so this was not a footnote in history. Alabama derived 73% of its state budget in the late 1800s from leasing black people to plantations. And so it was a way of keeping the system going. A great tragedy in this is it's still legal to do it. And in fact, in 2019, we're seeing the highest level of convict leasing that we've seen since the turn of the century in 1900 because of the current president's immigration policies. There's a shortage of people to pick food. So black men are back in the fields working for free in 2019 in high numbers. Of course, not everyone got locked up. Most black farmers were in a system called sharecropping. It's a debt peonage system where you don't own your mule or your land or your house or your clothes or your tools. As the laboring farmer, all of those are on credit from the landowner, and then at the end of the year you settle up with a portion of your crop. The challenge is that in practice, these black farmers ended up deeper in debt every single year, and if you left the farm, you're breaking contract and you go to jail. So you need to stay on the farm. One of my favorite stories about Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a famous civil rights activist, is that she was a child, 6 years old. She was a sharecropper picking cotton in Mississippi, and she noticed that the plantation owner had adjusted the scales to undervalue the cotton harvest because that would benefit the trade. And so she went in the night and fixed the scales. And in her memoir, she says, that's when I became an activist. So thanks to Fannie Lou Hamer for that. Something that astounds me is, despite the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule, right? There was like no reparations for slavery after the Civil War. In fact, slave owners got reparations. That's a whole other story. Black people still managed to save money and purchase land over the course of a couple generations. By 1910, black farmers had purchased 16 million acres of land, which represented about 14% of the nation's farms. It was the peak of black land ownership for all time. And as you can imagine, well, I'll just ask you, if folks are not sharecroppers anymore and they're getting their own land, what happens to the economic system? It's not a trick question. What do you think? It's not going to work out too good for the plantation owners, right? They have competition and they've lost their labor. So they have another freak out. Do you want to say something about that?
Oh, I was just going to say the distribution of wealth should level out.
It should. It should. So what happened is what you see in this picture is 1910 was the peak of black land ownership. It was also the peak of lynchings. So a number of organizations cropped up, the White Caps, the White Citizens Council, and the Ku Klux Klan to punish black people for being too uppity and for having the audacity to leave the plantation. It's also around the time when many of the prosperous black towns like Rosewood and Tulsa were just burned to the ground. It was in retaliation for defying the social order of the South. 4,500 people lost their lives and their land during this process. And many of us may have heard of the Great Migration, which is when 6 million African American people left the South and fled to the North. And we may have learned about it in terms of opportunities in the factories during the world wars and so forth, but are not usually told the dirty underbelly, which is that it was a refugee crisis. Because I know if someone was burning down my house and killing off my family and trying to steal my land, if I could get out, I would definitely get out, wouldn't you? So there was a mass exodus from the South because there wasn't a future there. So this began the precipitous decline of black farmland from 14% of the nation's farms down to the 1.5% that it is today. Actually, I'll go here first. So black folks were like, we out for the most part, right? Went to the North. Again, labor shortage. And this is the moment when you'd hope that the United States would say, you know, this whole like stolen land, exploited labor thing, it's old. We should have a new way. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. Instead, the United States tried to figure out who would do the labor for low wages. Does anyone know what this program is? The Bracero program. So starting in the late 1800s, it was Chinese and Filipino workers who were invited to do this wage labor. By the 1930s, 40s, it became the Bracero program, which targeted Mexican workers. It's morphed into the H-2A program, which is predominantly Caribbean, South American, and Mexican workers. But the basic idea is fundamentally the same. And this is going to sound a little cynical, but it's really to create conditions abroad through trade agreements, war, and climate chaos that are so onerous that indigenous people will leave the land that they own and the families that they love to cross into a hostile territory and do labor that Americans with papers won't do for really any amount of money. We're talking about meatpacking plants where, you know, the repetitive stress injury and the loss of limbs is the highest in any industry. We're talking about pesticide exposure that causes permanent brain damage to your children. We're talking about being bent over for so many hours a day that your back never straightens out. So this is the type of labor. And right now in the United States, the labor protections that are afforded to most Americans actually are not afforded to farm workers. And we can trace that back to this time period. Does anyone know when this was and what was going on? I'll give you a clue. We're talking about a new version of it right now in the debate, Democratic especially party debates. Starts with green. What were you going to say?
New Deal?
Yeah, so it's the original New Deal. You know, FDR, post-depression, we're going to have prosperity for the American worker. So a whole slew of beautiful social programs comes out of this time period. We're talking about Social Security, right? The 8-hour workday, the right to a day off in 7, the right to collectively bargain, all of these things that we take for granted as basics in the workplace. But in order to build consensus with the Southern Democrats, they had to make a few exclusions to the law, namely to exclude domestic workers and agricultural workers who were predominantly black, because the Southern Democrats would not vote for it if black people benefited. And to this day, the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act exclude farm workers, which is why if you work on a farm with less than 7 employees, there's no federal minimum wage. It's why dairy workers in Vermont can be on 2-hour sleep shifts 7 days a week around the clock, and that's legal, right? It's why children as young as 12 can drop out of school and go work on a farm with no right to collectively bargain. It's because there's actually different labor laws. There's a set of labor laws for people who work in food and farming, and then there's a set of labor laws for everybody else, which goes back to an explicitly racist conversation in committee that you can read the reports of. So of course, not all the black farmers left the South. A lot of people stayed. But unfortunately, they were up against another enemy who should have been a friend, which is the federal government. Does anyone know what USDA stands for? What is it? Yep, United States Department of Agriculture. And their job, they manage a really huge budget, one of the biggest bill or law packages that there is in the United States. And their job is to support farmers and the food system. So they do things like give out crop insurance, loans, technical assistance, crop allotments, conservation programs, all those kinds of things. You're supposed to be able as a farmer to go down to your county office, submit an application, get some help. Almost all farms receive some type of subsidy or support from the federal government. But the problem is that Black farmers were denied systemically all the way through from early 1900s to present. And so that meant when there was a drought, the white farmers would get a loan for irrigation system, the Black farmers wouldn't, right? And this was sharpened into a weapon to punish civil rights activity in the 1960s, where quite literally, if you were a Black farmer and you went with a loan application, they would say, "Did I see you at the county courthouse trying to register to vote? Well, I'm sorry, Farmer Smith, but we don't have anything for you today," right? So these farmers banded together, to their credit, and they sued the federal government for these decades of discrimination. They had documentation and piles of evidence. They finally won their settlement in 1999. It was the largest civil rights win in the history of this country. But unfortunately, by then, most of them were in their 80s and 90s, and the average payout was $50,000, which if any of you have tried to buy land or even just a tractor, you know that's not going to get you that far. But it was a really important symbolic victory to show that the Black farmers' decline was not because of lack of skill or wanting to leave the lands, but really because of being forced off by systemic oppression. That was the Pigford case. So we're getting closer to present. We're now up in the north. And racism's a little weird up here. People don't just tell you right out they don't like you. It's some tricky stuff. And one of the tricky things in the north is something called redlining. Has anyone ever heard of redlining before? Okay, so also goes back to the 30s, but it's very much alive today. You can go on Zillow.com and still see redlined neighborhoods, which is pretty illegal. I don't know how they do that. But the idea is that in the 1930s, the federal government commissioned these maps to be made that ranked neighborhoods from most to least desirable to lend to, with Black and brown neighborhoods being outlined in red as too risky for mortgages. So it meant that Black folks couldn't get mortgages in their neighborhoods. At the same time, the federal government put out zoning recommendations to prevent the intermixing of inharmonious racial groups, essentially ghettoizing and preventing Black people from moving out of these red line neighborhoods. Sounds like not a huge deal, until you consider that 80% of wealth is inherited. Almost all of that is property. So if you can never own a home or property, you've been kicked off your land in the South, you can't get a home in the North, wealth starts to flow in a different direction in the Black community. Children earn money and they pay their parents' debts. In the white community, parents pass property to their children. And this is compounded. Just in my lifetime, and I'm not super old, the wealth gap from white to Black went from 8 to 1, 1980, to 16 to 1 today, which literally means that if you're a white baby born in America today, you will be on average 16 times wealthier when you take your first breath as a Black child. And you cannot tell me that that child was doing extra calisthenics in the womb to earn that 16 times wealth, right? It's because of inheritance. And so we have to look at all these systemic ways, systemic conditions that have led to that disparity that we have today. Which brings us to present. Anyone know where this person might be? Wager a guess.
In Louisiana.
Wow. Why do you say Louisiana? I'm fascinated.
I remember there being some food production stuff and some people were giving their foods and all of their items that they could for people who suffered from Hurricane Katrina.
Oh my goodness. Well, maybe. I actually don't know if she's in Louisiana. I was being more general. She's in a pantry or emergency food. But I will find out if she's in Louisiana. So I put this picture here because all of these events based on stolen land and exploited labor and essentially an extractive food system leads to a situation we have today where 1 in 3 Black children will go to bed hungry tonight, right? Where Black and brown communities are more likely to suffer from diabetes, heart disease, kidney failure, and other diet-related illnesses. Not because of not knowing how to eat or not wanting to eat well, but because of that map I just showed you, where you have food apartheid. You have the situation where certain neighborhoods, certain zip codes have a scarcity of food access, affordable, culturally appropriate options, and other zip codes have a Whole Foods and a Trader Joe's, right? And transportation and clean streets. Not because of the people who live there making bad choices or good choices, but fundamentally because of these systemic issues. It also leads to the situation we have today where 85% of the labor that's done on farms is done by Latino, Latinx farm workers, yet only 2.5% of farms are managed by that population. So I was looking at the Department of Labor stats, and each year, veterinarians and landowning farmers like swap back and forth as to the whitest professions in the United States. I think this year it's farmer, next year it'll probably be veterinarian again. But the brownest, or like most people of color professions, are in farming and food service. So you have a very racially stratified system. And it leads to the situation we have today where literally 98% of the acres of rural land are owned by white people. Actually, in the 2017 census, it's worse than it was in 2012. And so if you look at the whole history of the United States and the ways land has been shared by different ethnic groups, we are getting more and more racially stratified. So more land is going into the hands of European descendants over time. And I believe that the way we treat the human community is mirrored by the way we treat the earth. So it's no surprise that industrial ag is a leading driver of climate change if you count the land use conversions all the way through to the shipping. It's certainly number one in water withdrawals, and has a powerful impact on land use conversion. So it's not that we don't know how to farm in a way that honors the earth. It's that all those seeds that were braided into my great-great-great-great-grandma's hair have been forgotten by many and obscured. So I'm going to tell you the good news, because there's a lot to be hopeful about, but I've been talking for a while. So first I want to give you a chance to talk to each other just for 2 minutes. Not enough to get married, just enough to get to know somebody. So you're going to turn to a person or two next to you and discuss where were your ancestors in this history, how are your people connected to these past events, and I'll call you back in a couple minutes so we can share. When I say free the people, you say free the land, free the people. When I say free the people, you say free the land, free the people, free the people, by any means necessary. That comes from the Malcolm X grassroots movement. Thank you for talking to each other. So we have two brave souls who want to share something that was alive in your conversation with each other. There's no right or wrong answer.
One thing that we noticed that both of our families had kind of an urban history in the United States, so we were trying to work through how that's connected to this conversation, if not directly, most definitely indirectly, as cities, import food from these rural land systems.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Someone else. How are your people connected to this? And like both stories of ways that we're harmed or hurt, and also stories of like complicity, are very important to share and think about. I know some of our parents maybe got homes during the GI Bill, or maybe our families, lost their land in the South, but nobody wants to talk about it. So maybe we're recent immigrants and we don't know how this all fits, but I'd be curious. Yeah.
Just personally for me, I know my mom's side of the family is recent immigrants from France, but I know her great-grandfather was actually like an administrative official in Africa, like French colonial possessions, so a similar pattern of exploiting land from
What country, do you know?
Algeria.
Wow.
Yeah. And also her grandfather was a general there in Africa, so
wow.
That's a lot.
That's fascinating, yeah.
Country, but,
Yep. Right, colonialism wasn't obviously just in the United States, it was like a global project. Does one more person want to share? All right, I won't make you, because I still want to be friends after today, and they'll be mad at me. All right, so we're going to talk about what we're doing at Soulfire and how that builds on movements of resistance. Y'all know who that is, right? Who's that? Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is someone that I think of as a rememberer. Again, this is my midrash, this is my hypothesis, but I kind of imagine these seeds as these like little mythical points of North Star and inspiration that get passed down. And every generation, there's at least a few people who can see the seed, right? And Harriet Tubman is one of those people. So at Soulfire, we hope that we're also rememberers. And we really build our work off of Another wonderful quote from Fannie Lou Hamer. She said, if you have 400 quarts of greens and gumbo soup canned for the winter, nobody can push you around or tell you what to do. Which is brilliant, right? Because if you don't have anything canned for the winter and you're relying on the supermarkets and the sort of corporate food system, as soon as they put chains around that supermarket, you'll maybe last 2 days before you put down your voter registration paperwork, you put down your protest sign, right? And you crawl on your knees through the dust with your hands outstretched to feed your children. You're not gonna last long without food. So fundamentally, to get free, we have to have some autonomy and agency in the food system. So at Soulfire, we organized around this. We're on 80 acres of Mohican territory in Grafton, New York, just very, very close to you all. And we work on it in 3 ways. Regenerating our soil so we can feed our community, right? Training the next generation of farmers, and then doing organizing to change unjust laws and systems. So here's the first. We're actually farmers, not like theoretical Twitter farmers. I know that's kind of a thing these days. But yeah, we grow vegetables, we raise eggs, meat, forest products, and so forth. And every week we box that up into this, colorful, delicious, magical cornucopia, and we do doorstep delivery to the folks who need it most in the Albany, Troy, Schenectady community. So that's, refugees, immigrants, people impacted by mass incarceration. Everything's on a sliding scale. So folks who have more pay more, folks who have less pay less. It all sort of works out in the end. And there's about 110 families who get a weekly delivery, about 400 individuals from us, including the Solidarity Share program, which makes sure that every new refugee into the community is offered a year of free vegetables paid for by their neighbors. Sort of before Western diet takes over the way that folks are accustomed to eating, we make sure that fresh food is getting to people. And here's an example of, a typical summer box, which I feel so proud of, because when we purchased our land, it's very marginal soil. No one thought we could farm there, but it was all we could afford. And we use a lot of the techniques of urban urban garden remediation to fix the soil in the rural area to be able to bring forth vegetables. But of course, we didn't make up this idea of feeding the community. Here are other remembers who we base our work on. Does anyone know who this is? Black Panther Party. Some of you may know, some of you may not, that they spent most of their time and money on survival programs. So feeding 20,000 children free breakfast every morning in Oakland, driving elders to their appointments, running health clinics and grocery stores, and so forth. And this became the basis for the free breakfast programs that many public school children now enjoy. The way that we farm is called regenerative farming. It's what makes the soil better over time instead of worse. So we've seen an increase in topsoil depth, an increase in the amount of carbon that our soil holds. And I'll concretize that a little bit. So within one generation of settlers opening up the Great Plains, 50% of the organic matter was burned out of the soil through plowing, right? So it went from around 8 to 10% organic matter to 4 to 5% organic matter just in one generation. And so we really see the work of regeneration of calling that carbon, that organic matter, back into the soil through composting, cover crops, rotational grazing, and so forth. So we're back up to 12%, so we're very happy about an indigenous level of carbon in our soil. And we approach our buildings the same way we approach our soil. We're using locally sourced materials, so straw bale, timber frame, passive solar, wood heated, handcrafted, all the things, and making sure that most of the acreage is left for the wildlife. But of course, we did not make up regenerative farming. These rememberers did. Does anyone know who the person on the left is? Dr. George Washington Carver. If you've ever been to an elementary school hallway during Black History Month, you almost definitely saw this picture, probably with a peanut next to him, because he's famous for all these peanut oil inventions, but a lot of folks don't know why he was very obsessed with the peanut. Do y'all know what family it's in? What plant family? It's a legume. Legumes are amazing. They are very, very good at making friends. So what a legume will do is it will whisper to a rhizobial bacteria that it wants to be homies, and it will say, I made a little house for you in my roots and filled it with sugar, and the gases are just right, and all you have to do is move in and breathe in some of that atmospheric nitrogen and make it organic so I can have some. And that's literally why we have nitrogen in the soil, because of legumes and bacteria being friends. So he knew this, and he was looking at the way that the cotton monocrop was decimating the soils of the South, and convinced a whole generation of farmers in the 1800s to not do monocropping, instead to do crop rotation, cover cropping, composting, and heavy mulches. And he had to quote the Bible to convince them, because people were like, wait, you wanted me to not grow my cash crop, and instead I'm gonna grow some beans and then like turn them in? It just didn't register. But this was a generation before Rodale, who's often credited as the founder of organic, so not correct. This person right here, super cool. Has anyone ever heard of a farm to table? Okay, nods all around. Has anyone ever gone to a farm and paid money to harvest someone else's crop and take it home? Pick your own apples, stuff. So this is this person. Really insightful, because he was seeing that wholesale, like selling to a middle person, just wasn't cutting it economically. So he had this idea of farmers doing like direct retail. It's like, if you can convince city folks that they miss the country, they will pay you to be like members of your farm, and they'll come harvest, and they'll have a great time, and you can make a newsletter and maybe have an animal for them to pet, and it's gonna be amazing. Like, it's gonna change farming. And now when you look around at all these small farms, like how many of them have a CSA or a pick your own or whatnot? And so that really began in the 50s and 60s with the work of Booker T. Watley. But perhaps the most important technique of all is the spiritual aspect of farming. So when I was living in Ghana, West Africa, as an early 20-something, the women who taught me how to farm are called the Queen Mothers. They're these elders, they're really badass, super smart. They think the United States is so weird, so they asked me lots of questions about our strange customs. One of the questions they asked me was, Leah, is it true that a farmer in the United States will like put a seed in the ground and they won't pray or sing or dance or even say thank you to the earth, and then they expect the seed to grow? So I admitted that was the case. They said, that's why you're all sick, right? You're all sick because you treat the earth like a commodity and not like a family member. And so you need to do ceremony, you need to sing, you need to ask permission for the thing. So here we are looking a little bit the fool, but we just planted some seeds, so we gotta pray for rain and give thanks and all that. And you can see things grow nicely, so there's something to it. So the second thing that we're up to is training and equipping the next generation of Black and brown farmers. There are so many barriers to entry for new farmers, but especially farmers of color. Like, where is even the nearest land-grant university? And how are you gonna get a scholarship? And is the person at the incubator program gonna let you in? And can you afford to take a year off just to woof and volunteer? There's so many things. And so we realized really early on that a big part of our mission needed to be to create training spaces for new Black and brown farmers. And I thought maybe like 2 people would want to come or something, because who wants to farm? It's wicked hard. It's just not romantic. But then all of our programs filled up, like overnight. One Facebook post, I know y'all are not on Facebook, I'm old, but one Snapchat, whatever. They like filled up. And so now we have this multi-year waiting list, even though we keep adding beginner farmer training programs. And it's been really beautiful to see, we've been doing this 9 years, how many folks who've graduated are doing urban or rural farming and food justice leadership. And we've started doing a bunch of programs in Spanish for the farm worker community. So we have whole week-long, no English allowed immersions. And here's just a few of our super amazing alumni. That's my friend Keisha. She's in Atlanta, Georgia. She runs a hog farm, and she's running trainings for Black farmers to convert to organic. Some urban gardening folks. The top left, they're in Chicago. They're working with all immigrant communities who are undocumented, because you're allowed to own a business if you're undocumented, but not to have a job, like a wage job as an employee. So they have an urban CSA on an incubator farm. These folks are doing home gardens for people. So there's a few in our network. And we have a youth program too. This is like the Black Future Farmers of America, kind of. So we thought we would be rid of these young ones in a year. It was supposed to be a year-long program, but then they wouldn't leave. Like, they just stayed. So this is the 3rd year that we've had these same kids. We told them we're cutting them off at 4 years, and then we need like a new crop. But you see in their hand they have ancestor staffs, because part of our training about farming and land is also about how to connect to your ancestors for advice, for guidance, and for support. But of course, we did not make up this idea. These are some of the rememberers who thought of having educational cooperative farms. Does anyone know any of these people? Fannie Lou Hamer. So we've mentioned her twice already. She started the Freedom Farm Co-op in Sunflower County, Mississippi. There was a bunch of sharecroppers getting kicked off their land for registering to vote. So she gathered everybody up, bought some land, and they worked together. They ran a pig bank, they ran some farms, they had a scholarship fund. So she's considered one of the catalysts for the modern co-op movement. Over on the left, Shirley and Charles Sherrod started the first ever community land trust in the United States in 1969. Has anyone ever heard of a land trust before? There's like tons of them, right? So the first one, they just celebrated their 50th anniversary. I was down in Georgia with them for that event. And the final thing that we're up to is organizing. And this really comes out of a challenge posited by one of my elders, Baba Halfkenny. He was like, you know, it's cute that y'all grow collard greens and have youth programs. That's cute. But like, do you know what actual black farmers do? I didn't. He explained that actual black farmers in the civil rights movement were the backbone of all the organizing, which again makes so much sense. Because think about it, if you're coming down from the north to rabble-rouse and register people to vote, do you think you can book the Sheraton for your convenings? Or like meet at a local coffee shop to discuss strategy? No, like you'll be lynched, you can't do that, right? So the black farmers put up their homes as the gathering spaces, the hotels, the dining rooms, you know, literally the armed protection for these activists. They would have fake Bible studies that were their organizing meetings, and the pamphlets would be tucked into Bibles, so if you looked quickly through the window, it wouldn't look like anything was going on. So there would be no civil rights movement without black farmers, like full stop. So Baba Halfkenny's like, that's, you know, collard greens are cute, but are you doing anything for the movement? And so we got a little bit busier doing a few projects for the movement. One is called the Reparations Map. It matches up reparations-minded individuals with wealth, property, or love with black and brown farmers who need those things. And so we've had now over 20 projects that have gotten some land through that. So that's a pretty cool thing. This map turned into a whole new organization that we helped get started called the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. It operates in all the New England states and New York, receiving donations of land to give back to indigenous nations and to black farmers. So if you got some land, you can give it to the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, who will redistribute it amongst dispossessed communities. We started a griot collective that goes around and tells stories, which you think is like not actually the work, but we've noticed that every single person who comes to a farmer training program or gives away their land, so like both sides of the coin, do that because they first heard a story that inspired them. So we have 30 people, 30 alumni who go around talking about food justice all around the country and some internationally. And speaking of internationally, we also support our sibling farms in Vieques, Brazil, Mexico, Ghana, and Haiti. I mostly work on the farm in Haiti because that's where my maternal ancestors are from, but helping folks through disaster relief on their own terms. So if people say that we need irrigation, then that's what we're going to try to help do, not as some kind of weird like paternalistic extension agent or anything. And then doing policy work, which seems super boring, but it's so important, y'all. Like, I don't know if you saw the Atlantic article or Washington Post, but like black farmers are on the map for the first time in my entire lifetime in the major media. And we had the Warren campaign and the Sanders campaign contact our coalitions to ask about platforms. So it's been really cool. Ocasio-Cortez's staff also contacted us to help draft the Green New Deal. So we're working really hard to make sure that justice for farmers and farm workers is part of this next phase of governance. And we didn't make that up either. Who was doing the skit on the Larry Eat Leong today? That was you. So these are our folks. So Dolores Puertas, Cesar Chavez, the Immokalee workers, so many of our farm worker organizations that have organized for their rights really provide that model for us of what it's like to have a campaign and then work together to make change. So in closing, you know, we started out talking about how we all eat food and we all live on land. So therefore the food system is everybody's business. The way my daughter Nashima talks about it, she says the food system is everything it takes to get sunshine onto your plate. So the good news with that is there's a number of points of intervention to heal the food system, and there's really something for everybody. The one unifying theme, though, in order to make things right, is to follow the lead of the people most impacted by the oppression. Right? So for example, just to simplify this, if I wanted to work on combating Islamophobia in the community, who are the experts whose lead I should follow? Muslim, not a trick question at all, right? If I wanted to work on veterans' struggle to access health care, who are the experts? The veterans, right? So sometimes we get confused when it comes to race and like forget who the experts are. I can't tell you how many communities that I work in where well-meaning, like good-hearted, white-led organizations will be like, you know what I think these black children need? They need kale salad making classes in their kindergarten. And I'm gonna go teach them how to make kale salad and write grants and pay myself to teach them to make kale salad, and then like all will be well. But like, who said they wanted kale salad? And who said you're the one to teach it? So it's very, very important to remember that we've gotta offer resources and follow the lead to the people most impacted. And there's so many organizations doing this work all around the country. Many of them have like no actual paid staff, like no budgets, no web designer. And so there's plenty of work to be done just to support some of these existing organizations. And we have a whole list on our website on soulfirefarm.org/take-action of organizations in our coalition that need help. So if you're good at graphic design, you can volunteer. If you got some money, you can donate, show up at a campaign, things like that. So, who here loves Toni Morrison? Will you come up here with me? Yeah. As soon as you mentioned Toni Morrison at dinner, I was like, this is going to be us. So here's what we're going to do. To close, we're going to read my favorite passage from my favorite book. And we'll each take turns reading like a little section. Just stop wherever you want. Okay? See what you can do.
Never mind you can't tell one letter from another. Never mind you were born a slave. Never mind you lose your name. Never mind your daddy dead. Never mind nothing.
This here is what a person can do if they put their mind to it and their back in it.
Stop sniveling, the land said. Stop picking around the edges of the world. Take advantage. And if you can't take advantage, take disadvantage.
We live here on this planet, in this nation, in this country right here, nowhere else.
We got a home in this rock, don't you see?
Nobody starving in my home, nobody crying in my home, and if I got a home, you got one too.
Grab it, grab this land.
Take it, hold it, my brothers, make it, my sisters, shake it, my siblings. Squeeze it, turn it, twist it, beat it, kick it, kiss it, whip it, stomp it, dig it, plow it, seed it, reap it, rent it, buy it, sell it, own it, build it, multiply it, and pass it on.
Can you hear me? Pass it on. Pass it on.
Pass it on. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. If anyone has questions, we'll just take like 2 so you don't have to sit here all night. And then I'll be hanging out in the hallway if you want to talk to me more. Sure.
You were talking a little bit about distributing food to different members of your community depending on a little bit on income.
Yeah.
If you make less, then you pay less. And you said something along the lines of, everything's going to work out in the end there. I know you have limited time, but how does everything just work out?
Yeah, I can explain it. So we allocate a certain number of our shares that are above market value and a certain number that are below market value so that in the end, the farm actually makes money, which is important to us because we are a training center and we want to show people how to run a business that works but also has an equitable portion. So we're about a third low income, a third middle income, a third high income. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. Any more questions?
So this is kind of following up on that. I think the reporter, people tend to be kind of tight with their money. How do you get folks to pay above market value for shares? How do you sort of do that now with the higher income?
Yeah. It's such a good question because I would assume the same thing, but we actually have found that we have a waiting list for the high income shares. and we have to recruit for the low-income share. It's mostly because a lot of our high-income customers have heard of CSAs and farm to table, and they want to do something that they feel good about. It's hip, it's cool. Whereas a lot of our lower-income customers are like, CSA what? And so we spent a ton of time in the winter going to churches, Boys and Girls Club, Caribbean American Association, just building relationships so people even trust us. Because they're like, I'm giving you my EBT card number and you're going to do what with it? So that has actually, it's been the opposite struggle for us. Yeah. One more question if anyone has one. Awesome. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Like to that point, I'm interested in like the organization's relationship with like the white upper class farmer and like how that which is kind of sorry, I should be one waiting who like want to be involved and want to do something good and like also are don't want to or like are trying at least not to be and whether that feels like fitting into the organization well or that's
yeah. I mean, one thing about our organization, for better or worse, is we're not a membership organization where we have a board of directors that's all people from impacted communities, and that's who we're really accountable to. So we don't have to feel like we have to appease. But I'll give you an example that might be satisfying, which is that we were getting some pushback from our higher income members that they wanted like doorstep delivery in their neighborhoods, but we only do doorstep delivery in low income neighborhoods, and they have to go pick up from those neighborhoods, which is supposed to also be an education for them, because when you drive through and you just see McDonald's and KFC in corners, like package stores, that's supposed to be a like, oh, wow moment. So we've stuck to it, but we haven't lost too many customers for insisting on our values. They usually understand. So, all right, thanks everyone. Come hang out there if you want.